This is the proposed country of Baltoscandia. So, what if it became a reality in the interwar period? How does this affect the Second World War? Would Germany still get Memel for free? Would the Soviet Union invade the country over Karelia? And would Germany attack Baltoscandia as part of Operation Weserubung? I would answer all of these questions in this video, but also show you how the world would develop after the Second World War. If you have never heard of Baltoscandia as a concept, it aims to unite the Baltic and Nordic countries. So in the interwar period, this would be Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, Norway and Denmark. Of course, this happening is highly unrealistic, as according to the actual plans to form Baltoscandia in 1928, all members are similar by their size, geographical environment, religion, but also they have to respect and tolerate each other. All of these countries were relatively close geographically, and some got along very well, while others did not. Norway was just 23 years prior to that part of Sweden, so them joining a union with Sweden would be unlikely, while Finland had just gained their independence 10 years prior to 1928, so they are also unlikely to abandon their independence. Same could be said for all of the Baltic states. This means that any sort of a union has to start with a union between Denmark and Sweden years prior. The proposed members of Baltoscandia also differed in terms of religion, as most were Protestant, while Lithuania and small parts of Latvia were Catholic. But also they differed by size, as Sweden was about 10 times larger than Lithuania, which is a dramatic difference. This is to say that the Baltoscandian Confederation being formed is extremely unrealistic, more so than you may think. But if we abandon realism, we can have a really entertaining scenario, so let's just do that. To start off with the obvious, this country would be the Poland of the Nordic, as later both Germany and the Soviet Union would want to partition their lands. And I predict that if Baltoscandia were to become a country in the interwar period, that their territory would be discussed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Regarding how this country could come into existence, earlier I mentioned that Denmark and Sweden need to work together years prior, and later to attract other countries to join this union. The best way to do that would be during the First World War, where all of the Scandinavian countries were officially neutral. In this alternate history, I propose that Baltoscandia is first formed as a Nordic union, as the Baltics and Finland were still under the Russian Empire. Basically, Sweden, Norway and Denmark would fear that they could be invaded by either side, so they're going to form an alliance of armed neutrality. If one member is attacked, the others must join, which would deter Germany or the United Kingdom from attacking Scandinavia. Historically, such an invasion never happened, and Scandinavia wasn't attacked by any side, but at the time it was uncertain. Belgium and Luxembourg were also neutral, yet they were attacked. When the Western Front became one big trench, both sides were considering invading Switzerland as to get the upper hand and break the stalemate. In this alternate history, I would have the three Scandinavian countries to form this League of Armed Neutrality, potentially merging their armed forces as to better respond to a foreign threat. The thing is that these countries were all monarchies, and it's generally a lot easier for republics to unite than monarchies. So a full-blown union would be impossible, but they can create a political entity. This political entity would allow all of the countries to retain their sovereignty, and would aim to improve each member. The motto would be "In unity is the strength", and would field this cool flag. This political entity would look similar to the Nordic Baltic 8 of today, which is a cooperation format between the Nordic and Baltic countries. Basically, each country votes for a shared defense minister, economy ministers, state secretaries and etc. The plan would be that if there is a good Norwegian economist, the rest of the members can benefit from this, not just Norway, while the Swedes and Danes can help Norway in other ways. Practically, this political entity would look similar to the European Union of today, which aims to improve all member countries while retaining their sovereignty. What would happen is that the Scandinavian countries wouldn't be invaded, but the political entity they created would continue to operate in the interwar period, and it would prove to be quite effective. One major change that would happen after the Great War is that Denmark would retake all of Schleswig-Holstein. My reasoning is that Denmark historically didn't want to have any strong German minority, as this could have destabilized the Danish kingdom and allowed Germany to later invade the country. These were all valid concerns, but as for now in this alternate history, Denmark would be very close to Sweden and Norway, who are obligated by a treaty to defend Denmark. This is why I assume that the Danes could be less cautious of taking these majority German lands. I can see Schleswig-Holstein to become practically independent, but they would be under the crown of Denmark for legitimacy reasons. The citizens of Schleswig-Holstein won't have to pay any war reparations, and when Germany enters a massive economic crisis in the 1920s, there would be very few in Schleswig-Holstein that would want to rejoin Germany. The Scandinavian countries would also prove to be quite efficient, so the quality of life in Schleswig-Holstein may improve as a result of that. This is of course not too realistic, but the whole video isn't meant to be taken seriously, so remember that. So far, we have the Scandinavian countries working together for their shared goals, which is basically economic growth and armed neutrality, potentially including a shared armed forces. For Baltoscandia to be formed, we also need to include the Baltic states, and this would perhaps be quite easy. The Baltic countries had it pretty rough in 1918 and 1919, as they were practically at war with the Soviet Union, but managed to gain their independence due to German volunteers and British and French naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Lithuania was especially interesting, as at one point they became communist and claimed of Belarus, calling it Litbel. Then the Lithuanian communists were defeated and Poland tried to coup d'etat the nation, wanting to put pro-Polish ministers in charge that would vote for Lithuania to join with Poland. The Lithuanians also had problems with Germany, as Lithuania was awarded Memel, which they didn't particularly want. At one point, Lithuania wanted to trade Memel for Vilnius, but this was never accepted. The Lithuanians were also the main supporters of Baltoscandia to be formed, so they would for sure join this political entity, as to get protection in case there is a Polish or Soviet invasion. The threat of being invaded by the Soviet Union would also be felt in Latvia and Estonia, as the two countries would be isolated from their allies in a war against the Soviet Union, so they would for sure lose, resulting in them to want to join Baltoscandia as to deter further invasions. As for Finland, they are also very likely to join, as they had warm relations with Sweden. The Swedes helped Finland in their civil war in 1918, but also Sweden tried to seize the Åland Islands by force. This time I would have Sweden not to try and take the Åland Islands, as to not antagonize relations with Finland. Rather, Sweden would simply help the young nation overcome their difficulties, and Finland would be the final member to join Baltoscandia. In this video, Baltoscandia is not a formal country, rather they're like the European Union and NATO all at once, as they would collaborate economically and have mutual defense clauses. As for all of the countries involved, they would retain their independence, currency and policies, but would elect shared ministers in a shared government, not just their own government. The ministers of Baltoscandia would strive to improve the whole union, so an Estonian can help Denmark out and vice versa. The smaller countries can take advantage of the bigger and more experienced countries. The Baltics, for example, were very chaotic once they got their independence. Practically, these states were never independent in their current form, so when they got their independence, they didn't know how to properly run their countries. In this alternate history, the Scandinavian countries would help out the Baltic ones, so Scandinavian ministers can rule the Baltics temporarily until the Baltic nations can elect a stable government. Historically, the Nordic countries were among the strongest supporters of the Baltic countries' independence in the 1990s, and were the first to open up their borders to them, introducing visa-free regimes with the Baltic countries. Relations between all member countries would be great and all can prosper. The situation would be especially bright for Schleswig-Holstein, which wouldn't be part of the failing Germany in the 1920s, as Germany had many issues with their territory still being occupied. They had hyperinflation and were humiliated after the Great War, and then the Great Depression hit the Weimar Republic like a bomb. Schleswig-Holstein would practically avoid all of these problems, and would even prosper under the Baltoscandian system, so the residents of Schleswig-Holstein are unlikely to get radicalized and start supporting the German ultranationalists. Unless I'm missing something, I think that Baltoscandia would generally be good for all countries involved, so the whole union would better withstand the Great Depression and can prosper, while other economies are collapsing. Now, as I said, Baltoscandia isn't one fully unified country, but practically they have a shared economy and military forces. For the sake of simplicity, I would treat Baltoscandia as a single country from now on. The population of Baltoscandia in 1930 would be precisely 22.7 million people, being about the same in terms of population as the Spanish mainland. The thing is that if Baltoscandia were to further integrate into a unified country, they would be stronger than Spain in 1930. A more accurate comparison would be Poland, as the two countries would have similar population and military size. I still expect the ultranationalist Germans to rise to power and start to peacefully reverse the Treaty of Versailles, which was their initial goal. Baltoscandia is for sure going to have conflicts of interest with the ultranationalist Germans, but would this lead to a formal invasion? Baltoscandia would have poor relations with Germany and the Soviet Union, while them and Poland would have a love-hate relationship. On one hand, Poland also has the same enemies as Baltoscandia, which is Germany and the Soviet Union, but Lithuania and Poland have conflicts of interest in Vilnius, so Poland and Baltoscandia working together would be far-fetched. Baltoscandia's main supporter I think would be the United Kingdom, which wants Baltoscandia to remain strong and assert control over the Kiel Canal, preventing Germany and the Soviet Union from having a strong naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Germany is still likely to get the Saarland via referendum, then they would remilitarize the Rhineland, which would make some members of Baltoscandia worried. Their fears would be justified, as then Germany would annex Austria, which would make the Baltoscandian countries more worried about a possible German attack. All of these countries working together would have several benefits. Historically, after Norway and Denmark were taken by Germany, Sweden started building fortifications on the Norwegian border, violating the agreement of the dissolution of the union between Norway and Sweden in 1905. These resources could have been used elsewhere, as now the Baltoscandian countries would invest in defense in Memel and Holstein. They are also going to build defensive fortifications against the Soviet Union, but not near Leningrad. This is because since the position of Leningrad is quite close to Finland and Estonia, the hopes for Baltoscandia in case of a war with the Soviet Union is that they should quickly take Leningrad, forcing the Soviet Union to sue for peace. Basically, the tactics against the Bolsheviks would be the best defense is one of offense. After all, Baltoscandia is a huge country, but they have very few bordering provinces with Germany, so fortifying these lands would be ideal for defense. When Germany takes control of Czechoslovakia, all of Baltoscandia would know that there would be a future war, and that they need to mobilize and speed up their fortification build-up. As a result, Baltoscandia would be able to mobilize about 2 million soldiers in case of a war with Germany, more than enough to hold the front lines. This time Germany cannot pressure Lithuania into giving up Memel as they did historically, because the Lithuanians would just now build fortifications in Memel, but also they would have the rest of Baltoscandia behind them, ready to support their member countries. Further, Baltoscandia is likely to support Lithuania for a really interesting reason. Some less committed members may feel the slogan of "Why die from Memel?", but with Germany invading the rest of Czechoslovakia, these claims would become laughable. Czechoslovakia had given up their fortified positions in the Sudetenland, so Germany later easily took the rest of the country without much resistance. As Lithuania would also build fortifications in Memel, Baltoscandia would know that if they were to concede Memel to Germany, that the rest of Lithuania may be taken without any resistance, just like Czechoslovakia. This is why I expect Baltoscandia to hold their own and not be pressured by Germany, as the two countries are about the same in terms of strength, as Baltoscandia would have fewer soldiers and have less of a modern army, but they would be focused purely on defense, so the playing field would be even out. In case of a war, the Allies or Poland could help Baltoscandia out, then Germany would for sure be defeated, as Baltoscandia knows that they cannot give concessions and still be able to survive. Germany and the Soviet Union are likely to secretly meet and express their hatred for Poland and Baltoscandia, later in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact dividing both countries into spheres of influence. The thing is that both Germany and the Soviet Union would agree that they should take care of Poland first, rather than Baltoscandia. The reason for that is that if they take Poland out first, they would have a shared border, which could be useful for both countries. Historically, the Soviet Union briefly supplied Germany with war materials during the Second World War, and even the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was adjusted to meet Germany's needs of oil. So, in 1939, ironically, Germany and the Soviet Union acted as allies, not just in partitioning Poland together, but also briefly supporting each other's war aims. As such, I can expect the Second World War to start in pretty much exactly the same way, and for the Soviet Union to also take part in the partition of Poland. As Poland is already dealt with, Germany would focus on the West, but there is one crucial problem, and this is the Swedish steel exports. The thing is that Sweden was supplying crucial resources to Germany, fueling their war effort, and without them Germany cannot hope to win a war against France and Britain. In this alternate history, Sweden is part of Baltoscandia, which would strictly have anti-German policies. In fact, Swedish steel exports can make their way to the Allies instead, bolstering their war effort. If this were the case, Germany would be in a similar position as Japan was in 1942. Basically, the Japanese were embargoed by the West as a result of their occupation of French Indochina, so Japan didn't have the resources to keep fighting the Chinese. What ended up happening is that Japan realized they are guaranteed to lose in the long run if they focus on China, so Japan made a gamble and attacked the western countries, trying to take said resources by force and at least have a chance at winning the war. Germany would also realize that if they allow Baltoscandia to continue shipping steel to the Allies, that Germany would eventually lose the war. Just like with the Japanese, Germany would be forced to attack Baltoscandia or be guaranteed to be defeated eventually. This way, Germany would at least think that they have some chance at victory. The goal of the German invasion would be to take out the Baltics and the Jutland Peninsula, as Baltoscandia would have to split their forces as to defend the two front lines. Further, Germany controlling these lands would allow for them to practically blockade the Baltic Sea to the Allied Navy. Then, via naval invasion, Germany would attempt to land in Sweden and try to get them to switch sides, promising them anything they could ever want at the expense of Denmark, Norway and Finland. This is an alternate Operation Weserubung, and it would have the same goal as in our own history, to make sure that Swedish steel exports go to Germany. Historically, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway as to isolate Sweden and make sure that the Swedish steel exports continued to flow to Germany. This was sort of justified, as the Allies planned themselves to invade Sweden. They planned to send volunteers to Finland during the Winter War that would pass through neutral Sweden and Norway. The goal of the Allies was for these volunteers to sabotage the Swedish mines and Norwegian ports, as to prevent these resources from going to Germany. Operation Weserubung was historically initiated by Britain as to mine the Norwegian coastline that was used by Sweden to trade with Germany. Then Britain planned to invade Norway in their operation called Plan R4, with the goal of occupying the major ports of Norway, but this partially happened as Germany also invaded Norway at exactly the same time. So the British troops sided with the Norwegians and were fighting in the country up until the fall of France. I'm telling you all of this as to say that Germany would for sure invade Baltoscandia in this alternate history, while Britain would defend the country, sending troops and support, but also navally blockading Germany. In this alternate history, Germany still invades, and I expect them to eventually push the Danes out of the Jutland Peninsula, while taking out Lithuania and half of Latvia, before they run out of steam and start experiencing material shortages. The Soviet Union is unlikely to also invade Baltoscandia as to help Germany. If the Soviet Union invades the country, their front lines may crumble and the country could collapse, but the Soviet Union wouldn't want to provoke war with the West, so they're likely to take the path of least resistance and bully Romania into giving them Bessarabia. In the meantime, the Soviet Union would focus more on Asia and help out Communist China, instead of focusing on Europe, where they would want both sides to exhaust themselves, and then for the Soviets to declare war on the victorious side and throw over the entire continent. If this is the case, I would expect the Soviet Union to slightly support the losing side, as to make sure that there is more casualties and destruction on both sides. As such, the Soviet Union can collaborate more with Germany, giving them the needed oil and steel as to keep fighting the West. At that point, Germany is not in a great position, and let us not forget that Italy is still not in the war, and due to the German position, they are unlikely to join. Historically, Italy joined just before France officially surrendered. While in this alternate history, Germany is stretched too thin and are likely to focus on defeating France after they're done with Baltoscandia. With a Royal Navy protecting Baltoscandia, the Germans wouldn't be able to land in Scandinavia, but I expect them to take off the Baltic states. At that point, the fall of France would be delayed significantly, so the French are better prepared for this war, and even if it's brought to their doorstep, they are likely to defend themselves. I'd say that Belgium would fear that they would be used once again as to go around the Maginot Line, so Belgium may cooperate with the Allies, allowing them to station troops there as to defend, but also build fortifications on their border with Germany. The Soviet Union would realize that Germany is becoming more of a burden, and they would know that each shipment that they sent to Germany would increase the chances of France and Britain also declaring war on the Soviets. As Stalin is famous for being paranoid, not only he would purge the army, but also he would fear that the Allies are going to invade as soon as Germany falls. Germany at that point would be stopped from expanding further, as they cannot conquer Baltoscandia, while they lack the resources to take out France. The thing is that even if the Germans were to somehow capitulate France, the French don't have enough steel to sustain the German army needs, so Germany wouldn't be interested in conquering France in the short term. The thing is that the ultranationalist Germans would still despise the communists and see them as inferior in terms of ideology, but also viewing the Slavic people as subhuman. Germany receiving support from the Soviet Union would undermine their legitimacy, so I would say that Germany would be stalemated and cannot do anything in this position. Of course, don't take this video too seriously, as Baltoscandia forming would be impossible in the first place, but this is just alternate history, meant for entertainment, not realism. In this alternate history, I would have the Soviet Union to betray Germany and declare war on the Germans. The reason for that is because the Soviets know that the Allies would win eventually, and Stalin doesn't want the Allies to install a friendly government in Germany that would later fight against the Soviet Union. This is why I think that the Soviets would declare war on Germany as to get more of the spoils of war and have a better position against the Allies in a future potential war. When the Soviet Union occupies the Baltics, they would return this land to Baltoscandia rather than occupying it themselves. The reason for that is that if they were to annex these lands, this would provoke the Allies to also declare war on the Soviet Union, and potentially for Germany to sign a separate peace treaty and switch sides. Stalin wouldn't want to risk a war with the Allies as well, not for Latvia and Estonia, so he would play the long game and would try to weaken the Allies over time, being more patient. Germany would be fighting on almost all sides, and the situation for them would look hopeless, due to geographical proximity, but also the fact that the Germans were caught by surprise and most of their soldiers were stationed in France or Denmark. The Soviet Union would make a lot of quick and impressive gains, despite their great purge. This time the Soviet Union can claim that they are the liberators of Poland, which could be their casus belli as to enter the war. I think it's fair to say that the Soviet Union would be the first to reach Berlin, while France would switch from a defensive strategy to one of offense. Basically, the Allies without the United States of America aren't going to make a lot of impressive gains in Germany, so the Soviet Union would receive most of the spoils of war, while suffering the least damage, creating for a tense environment. As Germany would eventually surrender, in the peace treaty I would have Baltoscandia to restore their pre-war borders, but also getting all of East Prussia, which would be a liberated country that would join the Baltoscandian political entity, similarly to Schleswig-Holstein. Baltoscandia getting the island of Rügen and also the city of Rostov formally being part of Swedish Pomerania is possible, but I don't think that they would do just that as to not provoke war with the Soviet Union. Speaking of the Soviet Union, they would annex parts of Poland, but also grant them former German lands in Silesia and Pomerania, while allowing Poland to directly annex Danzig. This time, the Poles would see the Soviet Union as liberators from the German oppressors, but instead the Soviet Union would become the new oppressors of the Polish people, forcing a communist regime upon them and not allowing the government in exile to return. Czechoslovakia is likely to be restored and also become communist, perhaps willingly. The fact is that Czechoslovakia was betrayed by France and Britain in the Munich conference, while the Soviet Union historically wanted to help out the country. Czechoslovakia would become a communist state, allied with the Soviet Union, but they would not regain southern Slovakia and Carpathian Ruthenia, as Hungary would refuse to hand these lands over. Instead, they would ally with the West. As for the rest of Germany, I can see France to directly annex the Saarland, with Austria becoming a free country once again, not being in the Soviet or Allied sphere of influence. The question then becomes what happens to the rest of Germany. Since the war would be a lot shorter, a prolonged occupation of the country would be very unpopular. Still, due to disagreements, I can see East and West Germany to be formed eventually. Historically, the goal was never to partition Germany, rather for occupation zones to merge into a single country that the Allies believed would go democratic, while the Soviets believed that this new Germany would go communist. Perhaps the same happens in this alternate history, but the Soviet occupation zone is drastically larger, potentially including Bremen and Hanover as well. This is due to the Soviet Union striking Germany without notice, breaking their 5-year peace treaty and taking advantage of a weakened Germany. The world would look like this, with Italy still occupying Albania and Spain being led by Francisco Franco. I can absolutely see a Latin axis to be formed, with Italy, Spain, Portugal and Romania being the members of this alliance. The goal would be to prevent communism to spread to these countries, but also for them to take revenge on the countries that did them wrong. I can see Bulgaria to join this alliance as well, as they would want to partition Yugoslavia together with Italy and Italian Albania. Historically, Italy and Bulgaria had really warm relations, and the two countries even had a royal marriage before the start of the Second World War. As for Baltoscandia, they would be very similar to Finland of our own history. The term is called Finlandization, where a country is sandwiched between two powerful sides, which forces them to be neutral. Basically, Baltoscandia is likely to remain safe and become the Switzerland of the North. While Germany is dealt with, Japan is still waging war against China, since the Soviet Union doesn't have to worry about Europe for now, and their army is already mobilized. I can see them to increase their support to Mao and the Communist Chinese. While the West would support nationalist China, Japan would be supported by the Latin Axis, so the three major factions in Europe would start a massive proxy war in China. The Japanese and their allies are by far the weakest, So when they're inevitably defeated, the Soviet Union and the Allies would support different sides of the Chinese Civil War, perhaps making it deadlier and for it to take longer. I honestly don't know which side would come on top, but we have reached a really interesting ending. Who knew that Baltoscandia uniting would result in millions more casualties in China? This is the butterfly effect at its finest. Now I would recommend you take a look at this video where Sweden-Norway never breaks up in 1905. The video has a similar backstory, but explores the potential where Sweden-Norway is still invaded by Germany, but is defeated. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.